Okay, welcome everybody to this new edition of the Ken Seminar Series, Fall 2025. Today we're delighted to have a known face in the department. We are going to be featuring Denissa Purba today. Denissa is a postdoctoral researcher at BOKU University in Vienna, Austria. She holds a doctorate and a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and also a bachelor's degree from the Institute Technology Bandung in Indonesia. Her research blends electrified transportation planning, energy infrastructure, and evacuation modeling to improve resilience to disasters and climate change. She has been advancing the adoption of alternative fuel vehicles and strengthens emergency preparedness through interdisciplinary data-driven work, connecting engineering, policy, and behavioral insights to support a safer and more sustainable mobility. In addition to that, as a past student in the department, Denissa has been an active graduate student that got to lead the ASE Transportation and Development Institute. So it is my pleasure to introduce her today. So please, let's welcome her with a warm round of applause.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a great honor to be back to ICT, especially for the Ken seminar. I recently moved to Austria to start my postdoctoral here at Institute of Transportation Study at BOKU University at Wien. But today I would like to present some works that is part of my dissertations that I did in UIUC. The title for today is the Electric Vehicles Evacuation Vulnerability Assessments and Behavioral Insight. Okay, so here's our today's outlines. I will start with the motivations of why the evacuation planning for alternative fuel vehicles is very important, and then I will dive into two works on the vulnerability assessment and the evacuation behaviors, and then close it with the policy implications and future works. So alternative fuel vehicles, including electric vehicles or EVs, hydrogens, and hybrid fuels, has contributed to transportation system decarbonizations, not only in the United States, but also in global. And the technology of these vehicles has been matured throughout the years. However, some of these technological characteristics in terms of driving range, sparse refueling infrastructures networks, and also refueling time that is longer than conventional gasoline vehicles makes this the transportation planning for these emerging vehicles become different than conventional one. While these technology specifications of these emerging vehicles can still facilitate our daily mobility, it might challenge the evacuation operations. And there is a study of evacuation movement of Miami residents here during Hurricane Irma shows that the evacuation distance can far exceed 300 miles, exceeding the average driving range of some alternative fuel vehicles in the current markets that we have right now. We also observe, especially in the US context, there are more frequent hazard happens in several regions that might require evacuations, such as hurricanes, severe storm floodings, and also wildfire. As the alternative fuel vehicles adoption increases, especially in these hazard-prone regions, it becomes very critical to provide the evacuation preparedness planning for alternative fuel vehicles adopters in the future. And since the introduction of alternative fuel vehicles in the US markets, we found that there is no adjustments to the evacuation policy. FEMA and Federal Highway Administrations suggest that an evacuation road planning needs to provide access to gasoline stations to guarantee opportunity to refueling. However, there is no specific regulation on how alternative fuel vehicles drivers can access or even have accessibility to their refueling stations. And then in the literatures, in terms of modeling, evacuation model often neglects the range constraint and access to the refueling stations. most of them always assumes that every evacuee could always reach their destinations without the need of refueling. And some of models assumes that refueling infrastructures networks is strategically located to allow every evacuees to refueling. While these assumptions in the modeling can be applied for gasoline or conventional vehicles evacuation models, it might not be true for alternative fuel vehicles. Is it moving? Okay. So the idea of this research objective is trying to develop a novel evacuation models tools and provide a policy recommendations so then we can strategically design an evacuation planning dedicated for these alternative fuel vehicles drivers and reduce their vulnerability during imminent hazard. We trying to understand how this vehicle characteristic in terms of range, revealing dependency, and also revealing time will impact the evacuation planning, and then use the principles that we obtain from conventional evacuation planning that has been done in the literatures to create new modeling tools that support this characteristic. And we trying to advancing the alternative fuel vehicles evacuation planning's research directions. There has been 4 contribution that has been made in this effort. And for today's presentations, I will just focus on the last 2 of this work, which is the vulnerability assessment and the evacuation behavior modeling. So for the first work is the vulnerability assessment of electric vehicles and their charging station networks during evacuations. This is a joint work, and also this work is also advised with Dr. Alastria Kontu. Okay, in this study, we aim to answer a critical questions: how vulnerable are EV drivers and their charging stations during real evacuation cases? Past work has shows that electric vehicles characteristic such as driving range and charging dependencies can create constraints during evacuation operations, and this characteristic needs to be integrated in the evacuation planning. Comprehensive vulnerability assessments become very crucial because in the emergency planning, it becomes the first step for us to identify and measure the vulnerability of the evacuation systems, and also enable us to identify what kind of strategies and protection that is needed to safeguard the infrastructure systems. So in this work, we aim to develop a multi-criteria vulnerability assessment frameworks dedicated for EVs evacuations. And we will assess current vulnerability of EV evacuation in 2 hazard-prone regions. Our approach consists of 3 main steps. First is about the data collections to develop a representative evacuation networks that can help us to simulate the EV evacuations. The data collections consist of the hazard intensity, which is the hazard footprint itself. We also consider the transportation networks, the charging station networks, not only the locations of the stations, but we also consider the number of ports, type of the stations, and also the capacity of the stations. We also collected the evacuation demand that we want to simulate it in our evacuation networks, and also the share of vehicles registrations to kind of design the shares of alternative fuel vehicles or electric vehicles in our networks. Then after we construct the evacuation networks, we conduct the simulations for the hazard and the evacuations. We compare the evacuation performance under non-disrupted networks and compare it with the evacuation performance when we consider the impact of the hazard and disrupted networks to the system. And then we assess it with the vulnerability diagram. We implemented into 2 cases. First is the short notice Chicago flooding evacuations, and the second is the preemptive hurricane evacuation in South Florida. Through the hazard and evacuation simulations, we consider 3 types of vehicles. We set up shares. Some of the evacuees will a share of evacuees demand will evacuate using gasolines, some of it using EV with short range, and some of it using EV with large range. Now I will talk more about the multi-criteria vulnerability assessment diagram that we propose here. It consists of 6 criteria that represented 3 components that we want to assess. First is the system level performance. We use 3 criteria to represent the system level performance during evacuations, which is the changes in average system travel time, charging time, and queuing time. The second component that we want to measure is the evacuation mobility. We want to understand the total number of EV drivers that requires to charge and how many of them being stranded or isolated due to disconnected networks or disrupted networks. The last component is the charging station accessibility. We use the betweenness centrality to measure the accessibility of charging station that is being used during evacuation processes. And then we present it in the radial diagram like this and normalize the value between -1 and 1. Here are the Chicago flooding hazard scenario. We consider 3 types of flooding risks. First is the mild, and then moderate and severe. All of the flooding footprint we collected from FEMA Flood Maps Service Center, and then we complement it with MRCC Southwest Lake Michigan Regional Flash Flood Monitoring. For each flooding risk, we define a certain area where we assign a probability of power outages and also road blockage. So you can see that this gray area here, we define it as a high risk power outages and risk blockage area, and it keep increasing throughout when the hazard intensity also increase. And here is the South Florida hurricane hazard scenario. Again, we consider 3 risk cases: mild hurricane, moderate hurricane, and severe hurricane risk. We collected the footprint of the hazard from NOAA Storm Surge Flooding Map. And again, we define the area that will subject to power outages and also road blockage. And here are the results for the Chicago flooding vulnerability. We visualize it with 3x3 vulnerability diagrams that shows the impact of the increased flooding intensity in the row side here. And if you see the column wise, you will see the impact of initial vehicle charge of state. So we kind of like consider 3 cases when all of the evacuees start their evacuation with full charge battery vehicles. The second case, if some of them start with half charge, and the third case is if some of them start with near empty, which is about 20% of their battery levels. And some key observations that we found here is that EVs with short range always requires to charging during evacuation, while most of gasolines and EVs with long range does not need to charge in this evacuation cases. And in rare and severe floodings, about 80% of charging stations located in downtown have a high flood risk. The charging accessibility dropped by 74%, and the stranded EV drivers can increase by 42%. When we consider the near empty initial state of charge battery levels, we notice that the number of EV drivers that require to charging, even in these small networks, can increase significantly due to the near empty battery levels. Here I also plot the energy demand profiles for Chicago evacuations. I think it will be the interest for some of you. Just want to highlight that our model can also shows the energy demand profile for each charging stations in our simulations. the findings that we found here is that charging station that is close to shelters, the shelters is on the north zone here, they subject to the higher charging demands. In our simulations, on average, the maximum expected energy demands in Chicago is about 337 hours in mild and 270 kilowatt hours in moderate and about 213 kilowatt hours in severe floodings. Next, we also explore the impact of cold weather in Chicago evacuations. We consider three types of weather, which is normal weather, moderate cold, and also extreme cold. And we translate these weather conditions into the impact, these temperatures to their impact of the reduced battery efficiency. So normal weather, we consider that the vehicle's battery can perform their efficiency 100%, moderate colds about 80%, and extreme colds, they drop to 60%. And again, we visualize it with 3x3 diagram to show the impact of increased flooding intensity and also these different weather temperatures. So we found that the extremely cold weather conditions and battery efficiency would affect the range anxiety and the needs to charge during evacuations. But the drop of 20% of battery efficiency from 100 to 80 is not really significant to the vulnerability changes. However, when they drop up to the 60%, we noticed that the number of EV drivers that require to charge increased significantly for about 14% in mild flooding, 70% in moderate flooding, and also 22% in severe flooding. Lastly, we assess the vulnerability of South Florida EV evacuation. In these cases, we only consider the impact of initial vehicle charge of state because we think that we noticed that during hurricanes, usually the temperature is not really changes. There is no cold weathers there. So we think that the impact of extreme weather is not relevant for the hurricane evacuation. That's why we only models the impact of initial vehicles chart of states. Again, we specialize it with 3x3 diagram. Some findings that is interesting here is that we found that the evacuation feasibility and vulnerability are unique depending on the scale of transportation networks and the hazard footprint. About 85% of coastal charging stations are at risk during extreme hurricane. It's reducing their accessibility by 36% and increasing the stranded number of drivers in the networks by 13%. And when we consider the near empty cases, EVs drivers with low battery state of charge are at risk to unable to initiate their evacuation without charging. And we can see here in these cases that the EV that needs to charge increased by 54% in moderate and also 93% in severe hurricanes. So for the summaries for this work, we found that most of EV drivers in the networks could evacuate safely without or with charging in mild and moderate hazard event. However, some EV drivers, especially those with short-range battery vehicles, rely more on charging stations accessibility to complete their evacuations. We also find that the driving range and charging station networks define existing EV evacuation risks. As hazard intensity increase, we consistently see that the EV drivers become more vulnerable. However, the feasibility and the vulnerability of the evacuations are unique depending on the scale and the properties of the networks and the hazard footprint. And we see that the initial EV state of charge will determine the feasibility to initiate the evacuations. So that's about the vulnerability assessment work. Now I will talk about the evacuation behavior of electric vehicles drivers. And here we conducted the road and charging choice experiments. This work is advised and collaborated with Dr. Eletria Kuntu. So now we're talking about behavior analysis during evacuations. So based on the past literatures, evacuation decisions depends on the individual and household decision making. These factors can influence our decision, especially to define a certain decisions in evacuations. For example, do I need to evacuate? Where should I evacuate? When should we evacuate, or how we should evacuate? Now, as the number of EV driver rising, we believe that evacuation decisions of these vehicles drivers are also impacted by the vehicle's technological characteristic. Now, the introductions of EVs might create a new decision questions in evacuation behavior field, which is we might also think which kind of like evacuation route that we need to choose. So then I can charge my vehicles. Can I charge my vehicles during evacuations, and where should I charge my vehicles? So these are kind of like new questions that might be arise as the introductions of EVs in the evacuation system. In this work, we're trying to identify the effect of various vehicles and charging station characteristic on EV drivers' evacuation routes and charging choices. And to do that, we conducted a stated preference survey where we designed the EV evacuation route and charging choice experiments, considering their evacuation route, vehicles, and also charging station attributes. Then we developed a logic-based models to characterize EV evacuation route and charging choices. So in here, there are four attributes that we consider here, which is the evacuation characteristic will be represented with the evacuation distance. Road characteristic, we consider two types of road characteristic, distance and their distance to the destinations, and also total travel time. For the EV characteristic, we consider the battery capacity and SOC at the origin and the destinations. Again, SOC is the state of charge. For the charging station characteristic, we consider the charging station location, the total number of charging stations during the evacuations, charging time, and queuing time. And we designed choice tasks according to this attributes parameters. So the survey is designed using engine software to obtain an efficient choice set, and then we distribute it using Qualtrics. In this survey, each participant will be situated in a mandatory evacuation order, and they need to evacuate using EV. Each participant will have 12 choice tasks. 6 of them is for a short evacuation distance scenario, and another 6 is for long evacuation distance scenario. And then at the end of the survey, we will ask their evacuation attitude regarding their vehicle preference, and also how they kind of like making decisions throughout the evacuations roads and chargings. We conducted the survey on July 26 to September 30, 2024. We collected about 255 respondents, and after cleaning the data, we have about 157 clean data respondents, which represent 1,884 choice observations. And among them, 61 of them owning an EV. And here are the illustrations of our survey choice tasks. You can see here on the left is the 100 miles short distance mandatory evacuations. We illustrated in the Chicago networks. So every respondents will kind of like present it with the picture of the evacuation route and the charging scheme. And they will provide it with this table with 6 road and charging scheme options. 3 of this road is without charging, and then 3 of them is with charging. On the right here is the 300 miles long distance mandatory evacuations cases that we illustrated in Florida networks. Again, we'll have the maps of the roads and also the attributes of each options of the roads. We presented 3 roads and 3 charging schemes that they can choose. For the short distance evacuation scenario, we will propose 3 models. 2 of them is the multinomial logit models, which is the first model is to identify the impact of the main attributes, and then the second MNL or the multinomial logit models is to see the impact the impact of the socio-demographic. And then we also check the nested logits to account the correlations between road and charging decisions. For the long distance evacuation scenario, we propose 2 models, which is 2 multinomial logit models for the basic one and when we consider the socio-demographic. Here are the behavior model for the short distance evacuation road and charging choice analysis. This is the first MNL, second MNL, and then this is the nested logit models. We tested with the main parameters. There are 8 main parameters here, which is distance, travel time, charging time, queuing time, total charging stations in the evacuation road, SOC at the origin, and SOC at destinations. We also check the interaction between SOC at origin and the SOC at destination, and also the interaction between total charging stations and the SOC at origin. Some findings that we found here. First is that the EV evacuee are more sensitive with the travel time and charging time in the short distance cases. And evacuation road with charging is not preferable. This is very expected because in short evacuation cases, we provided alternative where they kind of like able to evacuate without charging, and then most of them choose to evacuate without charging. And we also find that EV evacuees under these cases prefer roads that can guarantee a high SOC at destinations. And then if we check the interactions between SOC origin and SOC at destination, the interaction is substitutable. It means that when EV evacuee begins with low SOC, they are more likely to choose roads and make charging decisions that ensure high SOC at the destinations. But then when we check the interaction between SOC at origin and then the total charging stations, the interaction is diminishing. What it means that when the evacuees begin the evacuation with low SOC, they are still less likely to choose a road with a charging stops. And here are the behavior model results for the long distance evacuation road and charging choice analysis. Again, we presented the main parameters, the interaction parameters, and then the socio-demographics for each models. Some findings that we found is that under long distance evacuations, EV evacuees are more sensitive to queuing time. And then the EV evacuees significantly prefer roads that can ensure high SOC at destinations. We also checked the interactions between SOC origin and SOC destination. The interactions is complementary. So under long distance evacuation, even though that the EV evacuees can start evacuating with high SOC origin, they are still more likely to choose roads with high SOC at destinations. For the interaction parameter between SOC origin and charging sessions, we see that it is diminishing. So they're still less likely to kind of like increase the number of charging stations in their evacuation process. In the last question of the survey, we asked the respondent what kind of vehicles that they prefer to evacuate. And here are the results. We categorize it between non-EV owners and EV owners. For the non-EV owners, about 85.5% of non-EV owners prefer gasoline vehicles for evacuations. This low preference of EVs may indicate some unfamiliarity with this vehicles technology and some concern about charging during evacuations. Among EV owners, 44.4% of them choose battery electric vehicles to evacuate. However, still about 55.6% still favor gasoline vehicles. So there is a mixed preference here. It might suggest there is a lingering concern about the EV performance during charging, during evacuation, and also how they can charging during evacuations. We also asked the respondent to rank the attributes that are important for them to make evacuation decisions. So we presented kind of like all of our attributes like evacuation travel time, distance, battery state of charge at destination, and so on, and asked them to rank it. And we found that both EV owners and non-EV owners share similar decision-making priorities regarding their evacuation route and charging considerations. However, non-EV owners still more focus on the EV characteristic and evacuation performance. They care more on evacuation travel time, SOC at origin and destination, and also number of charging stations that's gonna be in the evacuations. This ranking might reflect their concern about the vehicles during the evacuations. For the EV owners, this tends to focus more on the attributes that represent the EV characteristic and charging infrastructure. For example, they rank vehicle driving range, charging location along road, and charging time higher than others. So this indicates there is higher familiarity regarding the EV technology and charging processes among EV owners, and they have a higher awareness of the importance of charging infrastructures to complete their evacuations using electric vehicles. The next part of this work is actually we're not only just designing the behavior model, but we also want to implement it in the evacuation routing plan. So we model these behavior models and embed it to the stochastic user equilibrium traffic assignments to simulate the evacuations given these behavioral models that we develop. And we again use Chicago and South Florida that we have before from the vulnerability assessment works, and we simulate it under Chicago moderate flooding risk and South Florida moderate hurricane risk. And due to the limited time, I'm just gonna showcasing, this is kind of like the evacuation performance where we're considering the behavioral impacts in Chicago flooding evacuations, and this one is the evacuation performance considering the behavioral impact for the South Florida hurricane evacuations. So this is the summary of findings for this work. We found that the non-EV owners exhibit strong preference, still exhibit strong preference towards gasoline vehicles, probably due to some unfamiliarity with the vehicles, the chargings, and also the evacuation itself. Whereas EV owners demonstrate more confidence, but still have some hesitations, practically for the long distance evacuations. We see the evacuation distance impact the evacuation route and charging decisions. Under short distance evacuation cases, when charging is unnecessary, EV evacuees are more sensitive to travel time and charging time. They still prefer not to charge. And when evacuees begin evacuating with low SOC, they are likely to choose routes that maintain high SOC at their destinations. Under long-distance evacuation cases, when charging is necessary, we found that EV evacuees are more sensitive to queuing time, and the EV evacuees choose a route and charging choices to maintain a desirable SOC at their destinations. And we also see that when evacuees start with a high SOC at origin location, they're still more likely to choose a route with high SOC at destinations. So just want to kind of talk a bit about the policy implication and future work for this. Throughout this dissertation work, those 4 modelings, we trying to kind of like define the evacuation planning and policy implications. And I think this is a very important part where we identify 5 policy implications that needs to be done for the alternative fuel vehicles evacuation planning. First is the evacuation road plan for the diverse alternative fuel vehicles. We believe that the emergency planner must design a unique evacuation routing plans for a diverse set of vehicles technology that accommodates the needs of their ranges and also the refueling dependency. We also think that the strategic deployment of supplementary refueling and charging station is very important. The deployments right now often focus on accommodating the deployment of the charging station or any alternative fuel refueling stations still focus on accommodating the daily mobility. In the evacuation setup, they need to consider the hazard footprint and the distance to the shelters and comprehensive hazard risk management for this charging system or refueling system and also the road networks is also important. We also want to highlight that the collaborations of emergency response authorities and refueling charging network provider is very important to make this system works. Some backup power supply plants can also become a potential additional supply or infrastructure to improve the reliability and resilience grid connect charging stations and to support the charging demand or the refueling demand during evacuations. The last part that we want to highlight is also the public EV evacuation guidelines. I think there is a lot of like EV adopters right now across growing in the United States, but how people actually prepare the vehicles, prepare their state of battery levels has not been regulated. And I think developing this public guideline will be very important in the futures. We collaborated with FEMA and presented a workshop in FEMA Higher Education Symposium workshop in 2024 to explain and open the discussion regarding the vulnerability assessment of these alternative fuel vehicles, especially electric vehicles drivers during hazard those events. We also provided a research showcase in ArcGIS story maps that you can access it here. And I think for the future research directions, I still want to advance my research in the field of sustainable and resilient transportation systems. And there are 3 things that I aim to answer in the future, which is how we kind of like integrate the grid and transportation system to kind of like better provide this electrified transportation planning, and also how we couple the electric and autonomous vehicles behavior modelings. And lastly is to strategically planning for electrified fleet system. I think these 3 directions is still an open questions. There's a lot of like open questions in this field, and I aim to contribute in that. And that's all about my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Denissa, for your presentation today. We are going to start now with the Q&A session. For any question that might be in the room or those joining us online. So we're going to start with that. Do we have any question now in the room? Go ahead, Akash.
Thank you, Denissa, for the nice presentation. I just had a small clarification question that when you're assigning a low SOC at the origin, are you doing it in a random way or are you using your socio-demographic data to assign it to certain locations?
So we assign every nodes with the evacuation demand in every nodes based on the social demographic, but for the SOC we assume uniform this shared in these nodes.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to ask a question in the room? Professor Yang, maybe?
Oh, yeah, thank you also for the presentation, very interesting. Just clarify a little bit, maybe you said, but I missed, when you are considering in the final survey that you did, the one that you have different evacuation scenarios, how do you address the reliability of the charging systems, whether the stations can be fully reliable or maybe not so reliable, or potentially congestion at those locations? Have you considered those?
In the survey?
Yeah.
No, I think in here we strictly assumes that the charging stations will operate in this road options. So we kind of like visualize the locations of the charging stations, but we also not but we're not letting them to kind of like choose where they want to actually charge, and then we just kind of like put increasing the total charging stations
I see.
as the variations of the alternative. Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That makes sense. The reason I was asking was, what I was thinking, maybe there's this reliability issue, but also, sometimes just like when we commute, it's not about the expected travel time, it's rather the uncertainty with it.
Yes.
That will affect how
Yes.
we travel, right? So
Yes.
I was thinking maybe that will be another factor. Can I ask another quick, just another quick question, Denisa, sorry, thank you. You mentioned about autonomous and then electrified vehicle, the last slide you mentioned. I'm wondering what behavior you plan to, just curiosity, it's very interesting, I want to learn what you're thinking about the behavior in the autonomy domain.
Yes. So I think so when I think from my from what I learned from the literatures, and also see how the vehicles markets grows, I noticed that the coupled autonomous and electric vehicles become more and more increasing in the market. And then I think in terms of the evacuations behaviors, there's always a premise where the autonomous kind of like system can increase the efficiency of evacuation processes and reduce the human error. So I was thinking that how we kind of like couple those things to kind of like, because one thing that I noticed from the last questions where we asked whether they want to evacuate with EV or not, there is a lot of most of the respondents still choose gasoline vehicles, and then I senses there is a hesitant there on the reliability of these electric vehicles, and I think introducing autonomous system in this kind of like vehicles might be have a chance to reduce those hesitant. So I'm kind of like I have those interests to kind of like explore that. And I skipped there, but actually right now in my next work in BOKU University, we kind of like focus on the autonomous and electric freight vehicles. This is completely different from the evacuations perspective, but we also kind of will conduct the survey to the truck drivers to see how their behaviors, travel behaviors, and also the freight operations gonna changes if we if they use electric freight versus autonomous freight versus autonomous and electric freight. Something like that.
Okay, very interesting, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question on Zoom asked by Mohamed Sawala. Mohamed, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question to the speaker, or would you prefer me to read your question?
Hello, everyone.
We can hear you now.
Okay, thanks. My question is, it's a nice presentation, first of all. It's a great topic for me. But my question is, how long it takes to generate the evacuation routing plan? for electric vehicle using the presented scheme. I mean, the assessment, generate routing plan for electric vehicle to leave the the area.
You mean like computational wise?
Yes, how long it takes?
With the current model that I use?
Yes,
Okay, so we use, do I have it here? Or let me open the, so we use the kind of like, let me try to close. Oops, there I lost
It's
you
okay, you can share your
guys.
screen again. Yeah,
Yes.
we can see your screen now.
Yeah. Yes, this is the evacuation models that I use. We kind of like simulated using we created optimization models for the short notice that minimize the total evacuations time, and then we kind of like created a range between a constraint and embedded in the models. And for the preemptive evacuation tree road plan, we use K evacuation tree road plan, and use for the charging needs, we use the range between a constraint. I haven't really checked the computational performance for the short notice evacuation routing plan, but we did test the performance for the preemptive evacuation tree road plan in our first papers. I can share you if you want after this, but I think it's about with the size of South Florida, it's solved within 20 minutes. I hope it answers your questions.
that's great. Thanks. And I hope you could share the paper with me.
Yes, sure.
Thanks.
Do we have any other question in the room? Denise, I would like to ask you one question.
Yes.
So is the purpose of the findings to try to provide guidelines of where to place these charging stations, or would you say that it would work better to have different evacuation routes based on vehicle types?
Yes. Actually, those guidelines is actually not only built with these two works, it's actually built by these four components. So we did the road planning, we did the design of deployment of refilling charging stations, and see what type of, where is the positions will be looks like that can support evacuations operations. And then we do the vulnerability assessment and then the behavior modeling. I think the plan as a emergency authorities and also transportation planners, providing the evacuation routes and also strategic deployment of the stations is very important. And a lot of people says that, I think that's in the EV communities, they always say that it's like chicken and egg, whether you kind of like increase, improving the vehicle's technology, or you kind of like densify the charging stations or refilling stations. But I think in the concept of evacuation planning, those two are a mandatory infrastructure that we need to provide, because FEMA and Federal Highway administrations really suggest that we need to provide efficient road that is safe and fast, but also guarantee access to the stations. Now, the question is that the charging stations often populated in the intercity, and they design right now to support a daily mobility. But when we talk about evacuation movement, there's actually out of the intercity. So we need to kind of like create another strategy how we accommodate those movement that is away from the city center, if that answering your questions.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Sure.
So much. Do we have any other question today? If that is not the case, all that is left for me to say is to thank you so much for being with us during today's Ken seminar. It's always a pleasure to get to see you again, and we wish you the best at BOKU University during your time there. So help me say thank you to Denissa with a big applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Denissa.
Okay.
Thank you.